And I'd just like to, just before I read my paper, just situate it a little bit. It's not really meant to be a standalone paper, but a summary of the critical junction of my thesis. So the two kind of thirds where I try to really kind of start expanding upon noopolitics. Okay. So if there is a key concern shared between the work of Bernard Stiegler and Gilles Deleuze, it is the question of how to think differently. This means assessing how thinking is turned into its opposite, the stupidity which prevents the actualization of a novelty at the heart of thought, which makes it eminently political. How this politics unfolds is where the difference between Stiegler and Deleuze appears at its most stark. For the former, it is a case of the noetic act arising from a process of psychic and collective individuation supported by technical systems, which is always a transformation of a social and artifactual context as a singularity. The indeterminacy of this noetic act is conditioned by its organological context, but the difference between them means that, to quote Stiegler, the improbable cannot be reduced. There is always an excess over the programmatic, an excess that animates it in the first place. Noopolitics concerns the cultivation of this differential transformation of the determinate conditions of psychic and collective individuation, which means that it is irreducibly public, and therefore must approach the question of maintaining the conditions for collective processes of transformation. Conversely, the Deleuzean noopolitical gesture concerns resisting the reduction of thinking to a collective or common image. Thought becomes political precisely because we must reject the maxim that, quote, everyone knows independently of concepts what is meant by thinking, and replace it with the notion that something in the world forces us to think. While the examination and critique of images of thought are central to this position, Deleuze is ambiguous on the issue of the collective image of thought. While he does not reduce thought or politics to an atomist opposition between individual and collective, he emphasizes moments of nomadism, deterritorialization, and becoming minoritarian over the public and collective conditions of thinking. He demonstrates, therefore, an apparent antipathy towards the social and technical determination that the indeterminate arises from. Nevertheless, the notion of event is relevant to an organological noopolitics precisely because it addresses the role of novelty in the current system of adoption. An expanded notion of the encounter will allow us to consider how events concern not just the technical suspension of collective and psychic individuation in the double epochal redoubling, but also how an encounter that arises from the apparently banal events of everyday life also possesses these powers of disindividuation. We must take into account the novelty that arises from the outside of the realm of techniques in order to introduce moments of the absolutely new. What is at stake is the collective basis for the constitution of a new regime of individuation, a possibility being liquidated by hyper-industrial capitalism. A disindividuating encounter can induce both thinking as the critique of the existing conditions of trans-individuation, or prevent thinking by keeping the subject in a permanent state of disindividuation. This state of anxiety reduces the pre-individual conditions and renders the individual unable to pass to the noetic act through singularization, but also unable to connect with and trans-individuate the technical and social condition of thought. So this suggests that events themselves possess poisonous and curative tendencies and should be subject to a pharmacological therapeutics and therefore a noopolitics. The beginnings of such a project will be sketched out in several steps in this paper. First, by reconstructing Deleuze's critique of the dogmatic image of thought. Second, the disindividuating moment of the encounter will be shown to be a moment of anxiety structurally prior to thinking. Third, the hyper-industrial workplace will be suggested as a site of the continual disindividuation of events that perpetuate anxiety. And fourth, the notion of event will be interrogated to understand whether it is pharmacological prior to its inscription in organological circuits, and whether the Deleuzean conception of this encounter can provide an understanding of the collective nature of a political response. So we find the bulk of Deleuze's prioritization of the encounter over a common image of thought in difference and repetition. As well known, the target here is the understanding of thought is nothing more than the capacity to represent experience in consciousness directed towards truth through the execution of this innate faculty. This principle of recognition, quote, is defined by the harmonious exercise of all the faculties upon a supposed same object, and is successful when all the faculties together relate their given and relate themselves to a form of identity in the object. The thinking subject imposed by the dogmatic image regards this particular distribution or transcendental model as the self in the I think which grounds the harmony of all the faculties. This transcendental subject, as the correct operation of the set of innate faculties, is regulated by two key postulates according to Deleuze, those of common sense, the innate and universal faculties of the transcendental subject, and good sense, the correct articulation of this capacity. So according to this model, thought is naturally upright and not a faculty like the others, but a unity of all the faculties in the model of recognition. This doctrine of representation is surmised under the dogma of thought as the process through which different is crucified, and what forces us to think is demarcated from that which merely busies the faculties of representation, in order for Deleuze to show that thinking arises from, quote, the clause of a strangeness or an enmity, which alone would awaken thought from its natural stupor or eternal possibility. There is only involuntary thought. The solution to a problem arises as novelty, which is not merely correct exercise of a transcendental subject, but the genesis of the subject in the act of thinking itself. The encounter reveals, to quote again, the presence of an unthinkable in thought, which be both its source and its barrier, the presence to infinity of another thinker in the thinker who shatters every monologue of a thinking self. So this unthinkable is the pre-personal field of singularities constitutive of the subject, but which nevertheless disindividuates it in the face of this immensity. According to Waters' philosophy, the task of thinking is becoming worthy of this event, which is the task of creating, quote, a concept that shapes and reshapes the event in its own way. So the relationship of this encounter and thinking renders the latter subordinate to a prior moment of disindividuation. This must be considered in the light of what Stiegler has highlighted as the tripartite function of disindividuation. First, it entails a situation where, quote, the social group regresses to the purely social, through which it takes on specific traits that infest the I or the ego. Second, it engenders the possibility of the eradication of savoir-faire and savoir-vivre in proletarianization. And third, it has a positive function in a modality by which it allows the individual to, quote, establish a quantum leap and cross a threshold in their psychic transformation, which means that the thinking subject is the individual who is capable of disindividuating, due not to his will, but to the artifactual and pharmacological situation. While the three forms of individuation are inseparable, this does not mean that all encounters induce the latter stage of noetic activity. This structure of thought is stupidity, the reduction of an individual to its milieu as a deficiency in the ability to give it form through thinking. This transcendental structure of thought is accompanied by anxiety, however, which Simondon refers to as follows. The subject feels itself existing as problem posed to itself, and it feels its being divided into pre-individual nature and individuated being. This feeling is the prior condition to the re-individuation that emerges out of the encounter that dissolves the subject in the face of pre-individual being. Unlike stupidity, anxiety confers the feeling that the subject, quote, is burdened by its existence, as if it had to suffer existence itself. As Muriel Combs summarizes, a lone subject realizes such an experience in the absence of any other subject, and owing to this absence. What is central here is that unlike stupidity, which is a reduction to the ground or pre-individual milieu, anxiety entails the experience of solitude which cannot be resolved in the individual alone. So solitude, which is revealed by anxiety in an encounter, is the necessary moment of diachronization before a new regime of psychic and collective individuation emerges. The question we must ask is, what occurs within the context of generalized unease and anxiety? Contemporary technical systems, characterized by the integration of culture and knowledge, aim towards the imperatives of the development of the market and consumer imperatives. Under these conditions, a constant bombardment of the subject with encounters perpetuates the condition of disindividuation that we find in anxiety. The subject is at once rendered stupid, reduced to its milieu, but simultaneously it is diachronized and anxious, abandoned to the solitary state that characterizes disindividuation in the face of an event. These twin poles of hyperdiachrony and hypersynchrony can be seen in the contemporary workplace and a position of knowledge as an object of consumption. First, the increasingly precarious nature of labour pits individuals against each other, competing in a situation for perpetual flexibility in the face of waning job security. As Paolo Verno precisely described this state in the 1990s, insecurity about one's place during periodic innovation, fear of losing recently gained privileges, and anxiety over being left behind translate into flexibility, adaptability, and a readiness to reconfigure oneself. We experience at every step of our intellectual labours either the feeling of decimation or the euphoria of being spared. This is a moment of intense diachrony, where individuals are intentionally separated and measured according to a logic of never-ending modulation and assessment. This induces anxiety at the level of attaining subsistence, rendering work a struggle and firmly dislocated from the joys of existence and consistence. Second, where the time of attention has become a commodity, it is imperative that it is harnessed as much as possible. The intensification of the dissemination of information in order to extract value from its cognitive processing means that it is not turned into knowledge, but merely the accumulation of hard data and the proliferation of non-knowledges. This is a hypersynchronization, where the individual is rendered unable to give this pre-individual ground form. The situation of anxiety is perpetuated at the level of existence. Unable to individuate information, individuals are isolated from consistence as noetic activity, and therefore prevented from singularizing events. The time of existence becomes a reduced time that prevents the subject from leaving the state of anxiety felt in the face of being by psychic leap into thinking. The perpetuation of the synchronic and diachronic dimensions of this anxiety prevent new regimes of individuation from emerging and leave the subject in a continual anxious state. The encounter is therefore structurally linked to disindividuation, not just as the moment prior to thinking, but as the very opposite of thought. So in this schema, the event is just as much the source of psychic and noetic individuation as it is the harbinger of subjective desolation as the perpetuation of anxiety. This raises two questions that are not fully resolved in Deleuze's work. Where the encounter is the source of noetic activity, it is also integral to the control society model he so eloquently described. If events have the potential to inaugurate two opposing tendencies, how do they attain this pharmacological character? Does it possess the characteristics of the pharmaca in and of itself, or does it attain these characteristics on account of its organological individuation? This raises a second concern regarding the collective conditions of thinking. If, as it is claimed at the end of What is Philosophy, the brain is the site of an individuation that not only constitutes opinion, but creative and rhizomatic bifurcations, then the challenge posed by organology is that the collective articulation of brains is as much a condition of thought as the encounter. It is ambiguous whether making thinking reliant upon the educational and collective milieu of mnemotechnics, which nevertheless it transforms, is antithetical to Deleuze's project. So first, thinking the event pharmacologically requires assessing two readings of its role in Deleuze's thought. The first sees it as a concept in a general ontology, a figure constituted of being itself. In Constantine v. Boundus' words, to begin with events and singularities, and to account for the constitution of a world on the basis of these things alone. The constitution of the world, of all things, and not just thinking, arises from the interactions between events in their virtual and actual topologies. Nevertheless, this image of the world as populated by events is not totally disconnected from knowledge. In Sean Bowden's words, quote, "The ontologically primary pure event does not exist outside of the propositions constitutive of knowledge, be this a knowledge which, like sense, is forever being actualized." We might even say that Deleuze's ontology of events is a transcendental ontology, in the sense that the world of events has ontological priority over worldly individuals. So according to these two views, while ontological, events are still able to produce encounters, but this thinking is generated in engagement with worldly events as pre-personal and pre-individual without reducing these events as being to the pure correlate of consciousness. On the other hand, it can be seen that the event is a hyperbolization of its absolute heterogeneity in a move which immolates ontology from within. This view is expressed by Francois Zurabishvili, who summarizes as follows. This event attests to itself through the production of singular categories and by the emergence of a new belief. For if knowledge, regardless of what one says of it, remains the fundamental disposition of a thought that addresses itself to being, only belief answers to the event, given the irreducible exteriority that the latter envelops and the challenge it issues to reason. Further, heterogeneity does not exist outside of thought, which is to say that it can be seized only by an act of thought. Zurabishvili is concerned with situating the encounter as the absolute outside that engenders thought, where events are the root of thinking, but irreducible to any ontological delimitation precisely because of their absolute alterity. So these two readings of the event point to an ambiguity that we can see in phrases like this one found in The Fold, that events are produced in a chaos, a chaotic multiplicity, but only under the condition that a sort of screen intervenes. According to the two views we have seen, this screen can be seen as either the criteria of selection that produces actual extension out of virtual intensities, or the passage to thought where an absolute outside produces thinking on a larval subject. We do find evidence, however, of the brain as the screen, which moves our investigation firmly into the realms of organology. To quote from a late interview, "The brain is unity, the brain is the screen. The screen, that is to say ourselves, can be the deficient brain of an idiot as easily as a creative brain." Opening up the brain as a screen means we must situate the Deleuzian event as either world or heterogeneous outside, always in relation to the social and technical conditions of the cerebral. So organologically speaking, the fact of an event is always constituted after its occurrence, through the irreducible co-contamination of the empirical and the transcendental, belied by the default of origin. The singular individuation of event, a noetic act that arises from an encounter, is conditioned by the collective criteria of selection supported by tertiary retentions, which means that any individual retention is always partial. Controlling these criteria is the means by which technical systems are integrated with financial and economic concerns in order to produce perpetual anxiety through the constant subjection of individuals to disindividuating encounters. To quote Stiegler again, if attention is always not only assisted but in fact formed by a psychotechnique or a psychotechnology, end quote, then these mnemotechnics concern the manner in which significance or asignificance is produced from an encounter. Events appear to take on a pharmacological character in respect to the mnemotechnical and organological horizon within which they are individuated. Situating the event outside of organology, however, is not sufficient to characterize its potential to destroy the individual capacity to think. For Deleuze, the sense of something that happens is irreducible to the actual element of the pure event counter-effectuated in a state of affairs. A criteria of selection intervenes, producing either thinking from absolute heterogeneity, or the conditions of the world itself in the process of ontological genesis. As we have seen in both of these accounts of the event, it is heterogeneous and therefore irreducible to this screen. However, to refrain from reducing the event to this screen, its organological horizon, we must postulate two conditions. First, that the encounter is pharmacological in and of itself prior to its inscription in organological circuits. One potential Deleuzian response to this move would be that it limits its potential. This would mean to miss that the character as pharmaca is tendential and irreducible, and therefore a source of novelty through its composition with other events and organological arrangements. Therefore, the second condition is that to prevent reducing the event to a properly transcendental element of thought, our access to this pharmacon is always mediated by a technical and social criteria of selection, doubling this pharmacological element, emphasizing one of its two tendencies, and negating the transcendental subject having any pure access to this event. So this modifies the two readings of the event that we have seen. It is outside of the logics of thought, a part of the world, but nevertheless not an ontological postulate, as it attains its heterogeneity from an always après coup reception by the organological. This would entail effacing ontology, replacing it with the genesis of idealities from the outside. Nevertheless, this irreducible encounter is pharmacological, as it possesses poisonous and curative tendencies before and after its differentiation. This understanding shares similarities with Blanchot and emphasizes the incommensurability of these encounters. He writes, "The disaster is not somber. It would liberate us from everything if it could just have a relation with someone. We have no access to the outside, but the outside has already touched us in the head." The encounter with this disastrous outside is therefore pharmacological. It can produce a significant event out of the encounter or leave us anxious. But how this occurs is always après coup, after the fact. It is our collective mnemotechnical and political attitude to these heterogeneities which determine how we can respond to their occurrence. So the noepolitical consequences of this reading become problematic when we consider Deleuze's stance toward the collective condition of thinking. While not rejected outright, the collective basis of thought is something that is refused as a structural condition. We find in the book on Foucault that thinking is neither innate nor acquired, and acquired is key here. It is not the innate exercise of a faculty, and again, key, neither is it a learning process constituted in the external world. We also read, in Difference and Repetition, that method is the means of that knowledge which regulates the collaboration of all the faculties. It is therefore the manifesto of a common sense, goodwill as though this were premeditated decision of the thinker. So Deleuze's concern for the puerile form of method implies a distaste for the collective conditions of thinking. To quote again, interrogation always takes place within the framework of the community. To interrogate implies not only a common sense, but a good sense, a distribution of knowledge and of the given. Thinking from encounters, therefore, for Deleuze, is antithetical not only to innate faculties, but also to the social condition of the operation of thought. In the face of a pharmacological event, however, can politics abandon the public character of thinking? Rather, we must assert that thinking is a differentiation of the encounter that is also a differentiation of the inheritance of modes of attention, precisely because the technical support of collective retentions, to cite Stiegler, are ceaselessly rerun, recommenced, reformed, deformed, and transformed by the individuals who retemporalize. Technical innovation and invention can act as one such encounter that disindividuates, but furthermore, seeing the event itself as pharmacological means extending this power of suspension to the occurrences of the everyday. The power to destroy psychic capacities is therefore engendered by the event. To understand the genesis of thought as inseparable from these social conditions does not reduce thinking to a common or dogmatic image, I would say. Instead, it can create the condition for the differentiation of these organological structures. The brain, as the site of the individuation of events, is inseparable from the artifactual context within which it is situated, and therefore the temporality that this context produces. This means that being oriented within such a context, able to connect to it via transindividuation, is essential to thought, and is the result of a process of learning and education. Deleuze states that it is apparent that acts of recognition exist and occupy a large part of our daily life. And he asks, who can believe that the destiny of thought is at stake in these acts, and that when we recognize, we are thinking? I am not here to say that recognition is thinking, but rather that the social faculty of recognition is prior to the singularization of thought rather than its opposite, as it provides access to techniques of thought that are hitherto differentiated. Becoming worthy of an event is the critique of established inherited structures of thinking, which in turn transforms these social conditions. This means that we must assert that the Deleuzean pre-individual field on which this event plays out is supported by techniques, and furthermore are the support of its projection as a future in a process of individuation. This pre-individual field from which we individuate is nothing other than a shared and collective image of thought. To conclude, in other words, thinking is enabled by technicity as the support of psychic and collective individuation, and therefore as access to idealities. This is conditioned by education, a collective and common image of thought, that gives access to critical differentiations of the encounter. This means that, to quote Text and Time 3, heritage is transmission and adoption of a difference through interiorization of tertiary retentions that are both spatial and temporal, but in fact precede the space-time differential and that form the projection surfaces for a principle of differentiation. This is irreducibly a social inheritance, as the retentional system, that is technics, to continue the quote, is constitutive of objectification as the bringing into view of all objects and therefore their differentiation. This connection between thinking and the organological horizon of events will have to be asserted in order to ensure noepolitics can reduce the poisonous tendencies of the event as pharmaca. Therefore, against Deleuze, we must state that the destiny of thinking is in some respect connected to thought understood as methodological, common, and based in recognition, because to think is to transform these structures by transindividuating them. The noepolitical concern of collective structures is therefore oriented towards creating, quote, social practices that create psychic and social individuals capable of criticizing them, that is, of individuating them to enable them to take action. So therefore, to extend this thesis, being able to criticize and individuate events and encounters, rather than being perpetually disindividuating them by them and sunk into a state of anxiety, should be a key aim of the noepolitical project. Thank you.